All right, we're going to explore some different sounds based on different scales that we can use within Baggs Groove. Scales in general are a big debate within the jazz community, like whether you really need scales or if you should even think about scales. I started out thinking of scales. I find them useful in some regards, but I think it's important to realize that scales alone, scales are useful for one thing. They're really useful for making sure you have the dexterity to play at the tempo that you want to play. So at the tempo that we're playing, I want to make sure that of the notes that I might use to create a solo here, I can play them at least at that tempo and probably a little quicker fluidly with eighth notes. That was the first scale that I have on this sheet on page 2 of the PDF. That's what's called a Mixolydian scale. It's probably the most common that you'll see with that first chord of a blues. Not always, but that's the most typical one. And it might sound kind of familiar to you, and if you look at it and study it a little bit, you'll notice that it's basically a major scale with a flatted 7th tone. First 6 tones of the major 7 scale are the same. But instead of, we're playing. Then the next chord is another Mixolydian scale. So in my key, I'm going from D Mixolydian to G Mixolydian. In concert, it would be concert F Mixolydian to concert B flat Mixolydian. There's no rule that says we have to start a scale on its root. So I just kept the scale in the same place. So when I go from F concert Mixolydian to the related scale, you could think of this scale as B flat Mixolydian. You could also think of it as F Dorian. So if you're into the music theory of it, there's different modes. And all a mode means is we take the same scale and just play it on a different starting note. So the sound's going to sound like this. So that second chord's a little darker. Second scale has an extra flatted tone in it. Then I'm back to the same scale I started with. Then I'm back to the second scale. I'm back to the first one. Here's where things get a little different. So notice we've had dominant 7 chords throughout, and every time we used a Mixolydian scale. And each time we only had to change one note, okay? That's probably the most important thing. In jazz, there's no reason to change a bazillion notes every time. We change the notes that kind of harmonically are dictated to us. So if you'll notice, in the next chord, that bar number 8, second line of the PDF, again, we're only changing one note. So we went from, this time all I'm going to do, based on the chord, I'm going to use for me, a D sharp, okay, a concert G flat, I guess, concert F sharp, whatever you want to think of it as. But in any case, by adding that note, all the other notes still are relevant, and there's no reason to kind of change things unless we have to. So as I play from that chord into that D7 concert, if I went to Mixolydian, it would sound like this. Which sounds radically different. By just changing that one note and keeping a lot of the common tones the same, I get this sound. And it just sounds a lot more fluid. So you can hear those natural changes going on in there. The top part of this drill is really just to get your fingers or slide used to moving up and down those scales. So you can play it along with the music if you want to. You can just play it on your own. It's not going to sound real good, but it'll at least get you comfortable with the sound. I'm not even going to play through the whole thing. Obviously, it doesn't sound real great. We really wouldn't want to play a solo like that, but we would like to be able to play bits and pieces of those melodies or of those scales whenever we want to create our melodies. So the second portion of this PDF that we have here focuses on something we can think of as a melodic cell or a shape. And really what we're doing here is we're taking segments of scales, maybe throwing in a jump here and there, and using it to create little melodies. And these little melodies and themes are a great way to build a solo. So notice what I've done here. There's a ton of repetition. I'm using the same rhythm in every measure. I'm also really concentrating between the thirds and the sevenths. So again, I think one mistake we make a lot as beginning improvisers is when we see the G chord, we feel we have to start on a G. But it's a good thing to start on other tones within that chord or other tones outside the chord. So what I'm really doing is focusing on thirds and sevenths as my starting point, and just building little themes with that. So you're going to hear how much more melodic this sounds than the scales that I just played. So I would highly recommend you use this drill as just a way to start building ideas. And after you've done that a few times on your own, then just do the same thing. Pick a tone to start on. You're already familiar with your chord tones, and just play up and down using little segments of the scales. You'll notice that a lot of times there'll be sections where you don't even have to change notes. You can use the same 4 or 5 notes even though the chords changed. That part of the scale doesn't necessarily change. So here goes. I'm just going to try noodling around on scales, sections of scales, and I'm just going to play up and down, little up and down patterns, little shapes. So again, all I was concentrating on was up and down, using sections of scales, and there was some really nice stuff that came out of there. I'd be happy to include parts of that into a solo. Again, probably not a tool that I want to use exclusively for soloing, but definitely a good starting point and a good way to connect things. So I might play some cool ideas vertically, and then connect it with a more horizontal scale thing. So you can see how those two things together, those two tools that you've now practiced, can really work to create a great solo. So go ahead, play around with these scale ideas, and when you're ready, we'll take a look at a splash of color.